She was 19 when her brothers cast her out, with nothing but a torn map and the $27 left in the biscuit tin. They said the map was her inheritance, a cruel joke leading to the worthless scrubland their father had ignored for decades. But what no one knew, what her brothers in their greed could never imagine, was that hidden in the heart of that worthless land was a secret that would rewrite their family's future and prove that the most valuable discoveries are the ones others overlook. Settle in with us for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Iris Dunmore was born of the rock and the high, dry Arizona air, the last child of Elias Dunmore, a man who spoke more often to stone than to people. Her mother, whose name she only knew from a faded Bible entry, had bled out her life bringing Iris into the world in a dusty canvas tent somewhere in the Bradshaw Mountains. Her brothers, Caleb and Josiah, were already 10 and 12, their hands calloused and their hearts already hard. They saw her arrival not as a sister, but as a final, fragile burden their father chose to carry. Elias was a prospector, a chaser of glimmers in quartz, but he was not an unkind man. He was simply a man occupied by a singular, glittering obsession. He raised his sons to be extensions of his will, teaching them the brute language of the pickaxe, the sledge, and the pan. They learned to read a seam of rock, to blast and timber a shaft, to endure the back-breaking labor that gold demanded. For Iris, he reserved a different education. While her brothers were down in the earth, Elias would sit with her in the scant shade of a pinyon pine and teach her his careful, beautiful script. He taught her numbers, the quiet, powerful magic of arithmetic and ledgers. He taught her to read not just words, but the subtle signs of the land, the way a certain flower indicated water deep below, the track of a Gila monster in the sand, the line of a hawk's flight. Her true education, however, came from a man named Silas Croft. He was a retired surveyor, a widower who had come to the territory for his lungs and stayed for the silence. He had a small claim not far from the Dunmore camp, a place he worked just enough to keep himself in beans and bacon. Silas saw in the quiet, observant girl something her own family had missed. He saw a mind as sharp and precise as the needle of his own transit. He'd find her watching him work, her gaze steady and curious. One day, he beckoned her over. He didn't speak, just pointed to the eyepiece of his surveyor's level. She peered through it, and the world resolved into a place of clean lines and measurable angles. From that day on, Silas became her mentor. He taught her trigonometry with scratches in the dirt. He showed her how to use a compass not just to find north, but to plot a course, to map a claim, to understand the legal grid that had been laid invisibly over the wild land. He taught her the language of patents, of sections and townships, of mineral rights and riparian law. While her brothers learned the value of an ounce of gold, Iris learned the value of a properly filed document. Silas also taught her to whittle. His hands, gnarled with age, were impossibly deft with a small, sharp knife. He taught her to see the shape of a thing inside the wood before the first cut was ever made. Her most treasured possession was the last thing he ever carved for her. A tiny, perfect sparrow, its head cocked as if listening. It was no bigger than her thumb, carved from a piece of ironwood, so dense it felt like stone. Silas had passed on from the lung sickness 2 winters before, but Iris kept the sparrow wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, a small, hard knot of memory and love. Elias Dunmore, for all his chasing, had eventually found his prize, a rich lode he named the Morning Star. But he was a prospector, not a miner. He was always convinced a richer vein, the true mother lode, lay just beyond his current shaft. He tinkered, he explored, he mapped, and he delayed filing the final, comprehensive patents, always meaning to do it next season. His meticulous maps and journals were his real treasure. Then the lung fever, which had stalked the high country all winter, came for him. It was swift and merciless. He died in the rough-hewn cabin he had finally built, his breath rattling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if seeing a map of the stars. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of stale grief and pine smoke. It had been 3 days since they had buried Elias on the low hill overlooking the claim. 3 days in which Iris had cooked and cleaned and kept the fire, moving through the familiar motions of her life while her brothers drank and spoke in low, guttural tones at the table. Now the drinking was done. Caleb the elder sat across from her, his broad shoulders filling the space. Josiah leaned against the stone chimney, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. They were so much like their father, in build, tall, raw-boned, with the same pale blue eyes, but they had none of his quiet introspection. Their eyes were chips of ice. Caleb cleared his throat. "We've settled father's affairs," he said. It was not a discussion, it was a declaration. The Morning Star, the tools, this cabin, it's ours. Josiah and me, we're partners now. Iris felt a cold stillness settle over her. She looked from Caleb's hard face to Josiah's mocking one. She had expected this, in a way. She had always been an outsider in her own home. "And what is for me?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. Josiah let out a short, ugly laugh. "For you?" Caleb silenced him with a look. He reached into their father's old sea chest and pulled out a long, rolled-up piece of oilcloth. He unrolled it on the table. It was Elias's master map, a beautiful thing of ink and watercolor on heavy paper, the work of a decade. It showed every canyon, every wash, every spring, every hopeful scratch he had ever made in the earth for 50 miles in every direction. With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, Caleb found the center line and tore the map cleanly in two. The sound of ripping paper was the only sound in the room, sharp and violent. He pushed the left-hand portion across the table toward her. "There," Caleb said, his voice laced with a cruel satisfaction. "Your inheritance, the Western Territories. All worthless scrub and dry canyons. Father never found a speck of color out there. But you're so clever with your books and numbers. Maybe you'll find something we've missed." It was a final public act of dismissal. He was not just disinheriting her. He was mocking the very things her father had given her, the skills Silas had taught her. He was sending her on a fool's errand, a public humiliation to cement their dominance. She was to be gone by morning. Iris looked down at the torn edge of the map. The jagged white line was like a fresh wound. She did not plead. She did not weep. To do so would have given them a satisfaction she would not grant. She carefully folded the paper, the crisp creases a small act of defiance, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She stood. "I will pack my things." She moved to the small corner that had always been hers. She gathered her spare dress, a woolen shawl, and the heavy blanket her mother had woven, the only thing of hers Iris possessed. From a small wooden box, she took her father's reading glasses and the small oilcloth-wrapped bundle that held Silas Croft's wooden sparrow. Caleb went to the biscuit tin on the mantel. He counted out the last of the household cash, $27 in coin and worn bills. He shoved it into her hand. "And you can take the old mule," Josiah added, gesturing out the window toward Jezebel, the oldest and slowest of their pack animals. "She's about as much use as that map." It was not kindness. It was the final sweeping of crumbs from the table. Iris took the money without a word, her face a calm, unreadable mask. She would not let them see her pain. She would not let them see her fear. She had her map, her mule, and $27. It would have to be enough. The eastern sky was a pale, bruised purple when Iris led the mule, Jezebel, away from the cabin. She did not look back. The sound of the heavy wooden door closing behind her was a period on the end of a long, difficult sentence. Her life, up to that moment, was now contained in the worn leather panniers slung over the mule's back and the folded paper in her pocket. She headed west, following the rising sun's shadow into the territory her brothers had deemed worthless. The first day's journey was a descent, leaving the familiar scent of pine and the cool air of the higher elevations behind. The trail, little more than a game path, wound down through chaparral and scrub oak, the landscape growing progressively drier and more exposed. By midday, she was in the true desert, a world of shimmering heat and stark, beautiful cruelty. The sun was a physical weight on her shoulders, and the air smelled of dust and hot creosote. Jezebel plodded along, her hooves kicking up small puffs of red earth, her pace steady and uncomplaining, as if she understood this was no longer a journey with a known end, but a slow, deliberate wandering into the unknown. Iris walked beside her, conserving the mule's strength, her eyes scanning the horizon. This was the land from the map, the land her father had marked with symbols for dry washes, rock formations, and the occasional precious spring. Thanks to Silas, she knew how to read this world. She noted the direction of the wind in the leaning branches of a mesquite tree, the faint trail of ants leading to a hidden pocket of moisture under a rock, the high, circling flight of a hawk that meant a thermal and nothing more. At night, the desert became a different world. The oppressive heat bled away, leaving a profound, crystalline cold. Iris would find a sheltered spot, usually in the lee of a rock outcropping, and build a small, smokeless fire, a skill Silas had insisted she master. She would boil a little coffee, eat a piece of hardtack, and study the map by firelight. Her father's handwriting was as familiar as his voice, neat and precise. He had named the formations with a prospector's poetry. Sleeping Giant Mesa, Broken Arrow Canyon, Whispering Wash. The torn edge of the map was a constant, jagged reminder of her brother's act. It cut cleanly through a region of complex, overlapping canyons. But even on her half, there were notes and symbols whose meaning she did not yet understand. A small square with the letters LS, near a feature labeled Coyote's Tooth. A series of numbers that didn't correspond to an elevation or a distance. They were puzzles left by a man who thought in layers. She traveled for 4 days. The world shrank to the simple, rhythmic necessities of survival. Find water, find shelter, keep moving. Her grief for her father was a dull, constant ache, but it was overlaid now with a sharp, focused purpose. The map was not a fool's errand. It was a final conversation with her father. A last lesson. He had mapped this land for a reason. Even if he had found no gold here, he had found it worthy of his time, his ink, his careful attention. That in itself was something. On the 5th morning, she consulted the map again. She had been following a long, dry arroyo, and according to her father's drawing, it should lead her into a narrow box canyon. The feature marked Coyote's Tooth, a sharp spire of rock, was now visible on the horizon. The small square labeled LS was somewhere just beyond it. A sense of quiet anticipation settled over her. This was the destination, the X on her half of the map. Whether it marked a treasure or a final bitter joke, she would soon know. She coaxed Jezebel into a slightly faster walk, her own steps lightened by a feeling that was not quite hope, but its close cousin, certainty. The entrance to the box canyon was a narrow slit between 2 towering walls of red sandstone, easily missed by a casual traveler. The air inside was still and felt 10 degrees cooler. The canyon floor was sandy, dotted with hardy desert grasses and the occasional skeletal remains of a cholla cactus. Iris led Jezebel slowly, her eyes scanning the cliff faces. Her father's map had been precise. About 200 yards in, tucked into a deep alcove and built against the solid rock of the cliff, was a structure. It was so weathered and camouflaged by the surrounding stone that it seemed more a part of the geology than an act of man. This had to be the place marked LS, a line shack. It was smaller than she had imagined, no more than 10 feet by 12, a primitive, desperate-looking shelter. The walls were made of rough-hewn planks, now silver-gray and splintered, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that had long since dried and crumbled away. The roof was a thick layer of sod laid over a lattice of juniper poles, and it had sprouted a wild garden of desert weeds and sun-bleached grasses. A single glassless square served as a window, a dark eye staring out into the canyon. The door, made of the same weathered planks, hung crookedly from a single remaining leather hinge, scraping a shallow arc in the dirt floor. It was the most desolate, forgotten place she had ever laid eyes on. It looked as if a strong wind would return it to the dust from which it was made. This, then, was her inheritance. A derelict shack in a hidden canyon on a worthless piece of land. The cruelty of her brother's joke settled on her not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness. They had sent her here to be swallowed by the emptiness. She tethered Jezebel to a stunted ironwood tree, where the mule immediately began to nibble at a patch of tough grass. Iris walked to the shack and put her hand on the door. The wood was hot to the touch, dry and slightly rough like old skin. She gave it a gentle push. With a groan of protest from the remaining hinge, it swung inward, opening into a square of deep shadow. The air that drifted out was thick with the scent of ages, dry rot, mouse droppings, and the faint, dusty smell of cold ashes. She stepped across the threshold. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the open doorway. To her right, a simple bunk was built into the wall, a platform of planks with no mattress. To her left, a small, crudely constructed fireplace and chimney were made from flat river stones and clay. A three-legged stool, one leg snapped off, lay on its side in the center of the packed earth floor. The space was a perfect cube of abandonment. Yet, as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she began to notice other details. The construction, though rough, was sound. The corner posts were solid. The roof beams, where she could see them, were not bowed. This place was not built to be temporary. It was built to endure. It was a shelter, not a camp. Her father, or whoever had built this, had intended to return. A sense of ownership, small and defiant, began to stir in her. This place was nothing, but it was her nothing. Her brothers had meant it as a grave for her hopes, but a shack could be repaired, a wall could be patched, a home, however small, could be made. She ran a hand along the dusty surface of the built-in bunk. This was her land, this was her shelter. The journey was over. The work was about to begin. The first act of claiming the shack was to clean it. It was a ritual of possession, an imposition of order on the long neglect. Iris took off her dusty bonnet and tied her hair back. She found a stiff branch from a dead mesquite bush and began to sweep. Thick clouds of dust billowed out the door, carrying the smell of decay into the clean desert air. She swept away layers of history, dried leaves, the husks of insects, the desiccated remains of a small snake, and decades of fine red dust that had sifted through every crack and crevice. It was hard, thirsty work, but with every stroke of her makeshift broom, the space felt less like a relic and more like a room. Once the floor was cleared down to the hard-packed earth, she turned her attention to the fireplace. The nights were cold, and a fire was not a luxury but a necessity for survival. The hearth was a simple affair, a semicircle of flat stones laid before the small firebox. Several of them were loose, the clay mortar having crumbled to dust. If she was to have a fire, she would need to rebuild it, to ensure no stray sparks could set the dry, ancient wood of the cabin ablaze. She knelt on the floor, testing each stone with her hand. Most were set firmly, but the largest one, the central hearthstone, rocked under her touch. It was a single, flat piece of sandstone, nearly 2 feet square. As she worked her fingers around its edges, trying to lever it out to reseat it, she felt an unnatural hollowness beneath it. It wasn't just loose, it was a lid. Her heart gave a small, sharp knock against her ribs. She remembered Silas Croft years ago, showing her how to build a hidden compartment in a wall. The best place to hide something, he'd said, his voice a low rumble, is where people are looking for something else. They'll look for a loose floorboard, but they won't look under the hearth. They're too busy looking for a chimney fire. Using a piece of scrap iron she'd found outside, she wedged it into the crack and pried. With a grating sound of stone on stone, the heavy slab lifted. Beneath it was a neatly excavated cavity, about a foot deep and nestled inside, protected from the dirt and damp by a careful wrapping of oilcloth, was a metal box. It was a standard tin deed box, about the size of a large book, its black paint now flaked and rusted at the corners. It was heavy. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. She set it on the floor, the metal cool against the dusty earth. She unwrapped the oilcloth, which was still supple, and worked the stiff latch on the box. It sprang open with a faint metallic sigh. The first thing she saw was the dull gleam of gold. It wasn't dust or nuggets, but a neat stack of $20 gold coins, legal tender, their eagles and liberty heads shining in the dim light. She didn't count them, but she could see it was a significant sum, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Enough to live on for years, enough to buy passage away from this harsh land entirely. But beneath the coins was something far more valuable. It was a thick packet of papers, tied with a faded red ribbon. She lifted them out. The top document was a letter folded in three. The handwriting was her father's, but it was not addressed to her. It was addressed in his careful script. To whomever finds this and has need of it. She unfolded it. The letter explained everything. This shack was not a line shack. It was his private office, a place he and Silas Croft had built to do the work his sons had no patience for. The papers were the true treasure. They were the original, filed, and stamped land patents and assay reports for the entire Dunmore prospecting territory. Working with Silas, Elias had systematically and legally claimed not just the Morning Star, but all the surrounding land, over 2,000 acres of it, under a holding company named Sparrow Holdings, a quiet tribute to his daughter's favorite carving. The claims her brothers held, the papers they thought gave them ownership of the Morning Star, were for a nearby, worthless patch of land that Elias had deliberately used as a decoy. Her brothers were, at this very moment, illegally mining on land that, according to the enclosed and notarized will, belonged entirely to the sole heir of Sparrow Holdings, his daughter, Iris Dunmore. The final paragraph of the letter made her vision blur. "I do not know who will read this," he wrote. "Perhaps a stranger, and if so, I hope this small fortune helps you on your way. But perhaps it will be my daughter, Iris. I have seen the greed in my sons, and I fear for you. They see the gold in the rock. But you, my dear girl, you see the world as it is. You have the mind of a surveyor and the soul of a poet. Silas taught you well. Use this knowledge not for revenge, but for justice. Build something that lasts." Beneath the papers, at the very bottom of the box, was a single, smooth, heart-shaped stone he had always used as a paperweight on his desk. She closed her eyes, clutching the stone and the letter, the coolness of one and the crispness of the other grounding her. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had provided for her, in the only way he knew how, with a puzzle only she could solve. The discovery of the tin box did not ignite in Iris a desire for immediate fiery confrontation. Revenge was a hot, quick-burning fuel, and she had a long journey ahead. Her father's letter had counseled justice, and justice, like the geological forces that shaped the canyons, was a slow, patient, and irresistible pressure. The gold coins gave her security. The papers gave her a plan. The line shack was no longer a refuge. It was a headquarters. She spent 2 days in the canyon, reading and rereading every document, absorbing the legal intricacies, the metes and bounds, the language of the law that Silas had taught her. She was no longer a disinherited girl. She was the president and sole shareholder of Sparrow Holdings. On the 3rd day, she saddled Jezebel, packed a small bag with the essential papers and a handful of coins, and left the canyon. She rode not east toward her brothers, but north, toward Prescott, the territorial capital. It was a 3-day ride, and she arrived not as a dusty, desperate waif, but as a woman with business to attend to. She used some of the money to secure a room in a clean boarding house and to buy a simple, sturdy dress of dark blue broadcloth. She walked into the territorial land office with her head held high. The clerk, a man with a green eyeshade and ink-stained fingers, was initially dismissive. But when she unrolled the first of the patents, his demeanor changed. The documents were flawless, the signatures of the land commissioners clear, the seals unbroken. He spent the better part of an hour cross-referencing them with the master ledgers, his initial skepticism turning to grudging respect. "This is all in order, miss," he said finally, looking at her with new eyes. "Sparrow Holdings appears to be the legal owner of record for these sections." The next step was a lawyer. She asked the clerk for a recommendation, not for the most aggressive, but for the most meticulous. He directed her to a Mr. Abernathy, an older man with a quiet practice on the second floor of the bank building. Mr. Abernathy listened to her story without interruption, his fingertips steepled, his eyes thoughtful. He examined the papers, the will, and the decoy claim her brothers held. "They have built their house on sand, Miss Dunmore," he said, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "And the tide, it would seem, is coming in." While Mr. Abernathy began the slow, deliberate process of filing injunctions and notices of title, Iris returned to her canyon. She was not the same person who had left. She now had a purpose, and that purpose was to build. She rode to the nearest settlement, a small cluster of buildings called Agua Fria, and began to acquire materials. She bought lumber, nails, a small cast iron stove, and a single, precious pane of glass for the window. Transporting it all was a problem, one solved by a freighter named Tom Galloway. He was a widower in his 30s, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind. He loaded his wagon with her supplies, his curiosity held in check by a natural reserve. He asked no personal questions, only practical ones about the destination. When he saw the shack, he simply nodded. "Tough spot to build," was all he said, but he helped her unload every plank. He became her first connection to the world beyond the canyon. A few weeks later, as smoke curled from her new stovepipe, a second person appeared. She was an elderly Mexican woman named Elena, whose family ranched in the valley a few miles away. She came carrying a warm basket containing tortillas, a pot of beans, and a small block of goat cheese. "Saw your smoke," she said simply. "No one has lived in the Croft shack for 10 years. She saw the work Iris was doing, the gaps in the walls. The next day, she returned and taught Iris how to mix the local clay with water and grass to make adobe bricks, a technique far superior to the crumbling mortar her father had used. A community was forming, not through words of friendship, but through shared work and quiet, practical offerings. The final piece fell into place with the passing of a Basque shepherd named Andoni, who moved his flock through the high country with the seasons. He saw her struggling to repair the sod roof, in exchange for watering his flock at the small spring in her canyon. He spent a full day with her, showing her how to cut and lay the sod in overlapping patterns, creating a living roof that would be both cool in the summer and insulated in the winter. The shack was transforming, and so was Iris. Each nail hammered, each brick laid, was an act of reclamation, building a new life from the ruins of the old. The legal machinery, once set in motion by Mr. Abernathy, ground forward with methodical certainty. A certified letter arrived at the Morning Star claim. Caleb and Josiah, flush with the gold they had been pulling from the earth, likely saw it as a bureaucratic nuisance. A second letter followed, this one delivered by a deputy from the county sheriff's office, along with a formal notice of injunction. It informed them they were to cease all mining operations immediately, as they were trespassing on the property of Sparrow Holdings. Their rage, Iris imagined, must have been volcanic. They would have stormed into Prescott, their fraudulent papers in hand, only to be met with the unassailable truth in the territorial ledgers. They were confronted not with an emotional sister, but with the cold, impersonal weight of the law, a force they did not understand and could not bully. The case never went to a full trial. Mr. Abernathy presented them with a choice. They could relinquish all claims to the Morning Star and vacate the property, in which case Sparrow Holdings would not sue for the value of the gold they had already extracted. Or they could fight, lose, and be left with nothing but a mountain of debt. Stripped of their bluster, they folded. They were left with exactly what their paperwork entitled them to. A barren, worthless claim several miles away, the one their father had used to mislead them. Their greed and their profound underestimation of their sister had been their undoing. Iris received the news via a letter from Mr. Abernathy, delivered by Tom Galloway on one of his now regular freight runs. She read it, folded it neatly, and felt not a surge of triumph, but a quiet, somber sense of closure. She had no desire to move into the main cabin her brothers had abandoned. The line shack, her shack, was her home. It was the center of her world. With Mr. Abernathy's help, she dissolved Sparrow Holdings and revealed all the patents and claims under her own name, Iris Dunmore. She began to manage her inheritance, not with a pickaxe, but with ledgers and leases, just as her father had hoped. She leased the rights to the Morning Hour to a professional mining company from Denver for a percentage of their profits, an arrangement that provided her with a steady, reliable income far greater than anything her brothers could have managed. Word of her story, in a muted and respectful form, spread through the territory. She was no longer the girl at the old Croft shack. She was Miss Dunmore, the woman who owned the Western Canyons. People knew her name. Her life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the simple, practical demands of her small homestead. Tom Galloway became a constant, welcome presence. His weekly deliveries of mail and supplies from town became an occasion for a cup of coffee on the small porch she had built. His conversation was spare, but his companionship was steady and comforting. Elena visited often, bringing seedlings for the garden. Iris had started against the south-facing wall of the shack. They would speak in a comfortable mix of English and Spanish, their hands busy weeding the rows of corn and squash. And Donny, the shepherd, made a point to route his flock through her canyon each spring and fall, his arrival marked by the distant sound of bells. He would share a meal with her, his stories of the high mountains a welcome glimpse of the world beyond her valley. The unwanted shack, the symbol of her exile, had transformed. It was no longer a burden, but a living, breathing place, a refuge that had become a source of authority and purpose. It was not fancy, but it was warm, functional, and filled with a profound and satisfying peace. A year had passed. The late afternoon sun of early autumn filled the canyon with a soft, golden light, casting long shadows from the sandstone walls. Iris sat on the small porch of her home, a mug of warm tea cradled in her hands. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine from the higher elevations and the earthy smell of her own small garden. The shack, once a derelict symbol of abandonment, was now a proper, comfortable home. The window held its pane of glass, gleaming in the twilight. The door was square on its new iron hinges. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a sign of life, of warmth, of presence. Her mule, Jezebel, grazed peacefully in the small paddock Iris had fenced off, her long ears twitching at the buzz of a late bee. Everything was in its place. Everything was as it should be. On the small, sturdy table beside her chair, two objects sat side by side. One was the tiny, intricate wooden sparrow that Silas Croft had carved for her, its ironwood surface worn smooth by the countless times her thumb had traced its form. The other was the heart-shaped paperweight she had found. At the bottom of the tin box, a stone her father had held in his hand 1,000 times. The two objects, one from the man who had taught her to see the world, and one from the man who had given her a world to see, seemed to be in quiet conversation. She thought of her father, Elias, not with the sharp pain of grief, but with a deep, resonant understanding. She saw now that his obsession was not just for gold, but for the order he could create from the chaos of the wild. the patterns he could discern, the maps he could draw. He had given her that gift, the ability to see the underlying structure of things. She thought of Silas, his quiet patience, his gnarled hands showing her how to hold a pencil, a knife, a compass. He had given her the tools to translate vision into reality. And she thought of her brothers, Caleb and Josiah. The anger was long gone, replaced by a distant, almost clinical pity. They had looked at the world and seen only its surface value, the glint of metal in a pan. They had seen her as a liability, a weakness, and in doing so, had revealed their own. They had been given the half of the map that pointed to gold, and it had led them to ruin. She had been given the worthless half. On the wall inside, hanging in a simple frame she had made herself, was her portion of the map. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, the tear along its edge still a stark, white line. She had never bothered to seek out the other half. She had no need of it. The part they had thrown away had contained everything that mattered. Iris Dunmore was 19 and her brothers had cast her out, believing they had left her with nothing. They gave her a worthless map, $27, and a broken-down mule. It was the greatest fortune she could have ever received. Thank you for settling in with us for the story of Iris Dunmore. We hope you'll share it with someone in your life who understands the quiet power of seeing the value in things that others have discarded. And we'll leave you with a question to ponder in the comments below. What is something you have built, repaired, or reclaimed in your own life that ended up meaning far more to you than just the sum of its parts? We look forward to reading your stories. Until next time, stay well.